Alrighty, so we're going through all of the different races from all over the world this week, and we're looking through it through this lens of four major lessons that need to be learned: um, individuality, um, community, logic, and faith. So we've already tackled logic uh, with the Chinese and how everything's rational and orderly, and yeah, it's good. They're productive. Um, we've tackled the faith with India and how they have this strong resilience that they can accept any bad thing and get through it. Um, Now we're going to tackle the community aspect. What race is the most cohesive and put together and tightly knit? Well, I would have to say it's probably Africans. People in Africa are definitely the most closely knit and most community minded people that, as far as I can tell. And here's the thing: the reason why is not as obvious. Because, in a sense, all of Africa was really just a bunch of tribes, right? A bunch of people doing their own thing, living in their own little family group, extended family, right? And so in a sense, they were just like any other Aboriginal group, right? Any other first people. They're doing their thing and they're making little tiny improvements, and it was good and it was awesome, but like, what makes them different? And the reason that they were different was conflict. It was because, unlike all the first peoples and aboriginals that we hear about, Africans didn't get the luxury of being left alone. They had Europe to the north and the Middle East to, well, the east. And there was a lot of conflict there, a lot of back and forth, wars and turmoil. And so while they always had someone to fight and someone to, have conflict with, at the same time, they didn't really have that all the time, right? Because there's massive land barriers between most of Africa and the Middle East or Europe. There's the desert, there's the Congo jungle, there's lots of things. And so they would only have conflicts on the edges. And so they were mostly secure and mostly safe, and it was mostly just, conflicts between their own tribes. But there was always this idea, this concept of someone else. That when it boils down to it, these are your people. And those guys, they're foreigners, they're outsiders. And that's not really an idea that most people had. That, yeah, sure, there's people that aren't part of your group, but that's like the whole world, right? That's everyone. But what happened with Africans, and to some extent this began to happen with Native Americans, but they just the time frame on that was just not nearly as favorable as with Africans. Africans had like a few thousand years to let's say 1,000 years to get accustomed to that, whereas for Native Americans it was like 100 years, and so they didn't get to the same point as Africa did. But Africa did get to that point where they said, these people look like us. They're the people we've been around for, ever, pretty much. They live near us. And even though they're not part of our individual tribe, they're part of our larger group. And this is not something to be taken lightly. And the African Americans brought it up to the whole next level, where it's now just a color. Right? Are you vaguely brown? You're on my side. Like, that's what it is in America now. That they keep moving out this tribe to include so many people until you can call it a race. And that's the thing. It's not something to be taken lightly that, people who look like me are like me. People who look like me are my extended family. They're like my friends. Even though I've never met them, I have something that relates me to them. And as far as I can tell, African Americans believe everyone has that. But that's not true. What they don't see is that for almost the entire world, the idea of being proud of your genetics is a profoundly new one. And so, because African Americans had this shared trauma of slavery, which was absolutely horrible and terrible, but at the same time brought people from all different kinds of tribes in Africa together, right? That, hey, we're together now. I don't care what tribe your ancestors were in, whether they killed my ancestors or not, right? We're together now. And that broadening of your family group, your tribe, is not something that happens all the time. Like, think about the European Union. They still don't feel like they're part of Europe. I mean, the whole idea of Brexit was people in Britain didn't feel European. But at the same time, we have African Americans who say things like, "Oh man, I would just love to visit Africa to say hello to the homeland, right? To where my ancestors lived." And it's like, you don't even know what part of Africa your ancestors are from. Most likely. And I mean, yeah, that's sad, and yeah, that's, definitely goes to show how bad slavery was, but at the same time, there's something beautiful in that. There's something beautiful in saying, "You look vaguely like me, I bet we'll be friends." That's a good thing. That is something so unique and so amazing. And you see, this is exactly why all around the world, every single country, you know who the coolest and the best and the most amazing people in the world are? African Americans. No matter where you're from, African Americans are synonymous with cool. Precisely because, what does cool mean? Cool is the person that's popular. Well, what does popular mean? Popular means they're the person that has the most friends. Being born African American instantaneously means that you got a ton of friends. Because you have this massive tribe, this race behind you that has your back. And you can tell by the way African Americans talk that it's like, "Oh man, us, we, black issues, all these things." And I think a lot of the reason why there's this racial conflict is because they have a race and no one else does. No one else thinks of themselves as a race, as if they have loyalty to someone just because they look similar. Like, there's been bad blood between France and Germany for generations. And there's this whole conflict between, even in America, the people with British ancestry and those without British ancestry. Because, don't you know, America was this British colony. Never mind that like half the people at the time that it was just colonies and not a nation, at the time, half the people were not British. Forget that, right? And so there is no white race. And we already talked about how there's this whole gradation throughout Asia. That yes, China and India are like the main sticking points, the main places of culture, the seats of power, if you will. I mean, they're the most populated, that's for one thing. But then everything around them is so different. Everyone takes a take, an interpretation, and an evolution on these ideas. None of them are the same. None of them are a race. There is no Asian race. There's no European race. The closest thing you can say is like, oh, well, there's the Native Americans. Well, they're not a race either. None of those tribes even knew about each other, besides the one immediately around them. They weren't a race. They're just, all that's left. And the same thing with every Aboriginal people. They're not a race. Do you think Pacific Islanders are a race when their islands are so far apart that they didn't even know each other existed for thousands of years? That's not a race. There's only one real, actual race in the world, and that's black. That's African. That's the only race that actually exists. And that's a good thing. Not that they're the only one, but that they exist at all. And it's easy to look at all these racial tensions. It's easy to look at all the times that black people have been put down and treated poorly. But the one thing they got in return was millions of people who have their back just because of what they look like. They look at each other and say, you're on my team. And then, unless you know someone personally, unless there's like some gang color thing going on, that's the default. And that's beautiful. The whole idea of community is to have people around you to support you, to raise you up higher than you could have been on your own. And African Americans have that. Now, there's lots of issues that they have that are undermining that benefit, for sure. But they have something truly special. And I don't think they quite understand how unique it is. Because after all, whatever you grow up with is normal. So everyone should have this. Because after all, we use words like race to describe Asians, to describe Europeans, to describe first people, right? We use words called race to describe those people, but they're not cohesive. They don't have any loyalties to each other. And so that's what makes African Americans so amazing. Is because they've developed this unique ability to look at someone and think you're on my team. I don't know anything about you. I don't know where you come from or what your story is, but you are on my team. And the even more beautiful thing is this is not even stopping there. You know, like 50 years ago, you know, the loyalty was to the color. But now things are even starting to change with that. There have been so many people fascinated with African Americans that now that team is expanding and broadening. And now it's not just people with black skin. It's a whole slew of people, a whole bunch of people. And as this inclusiveness expands to include, maybe one day most of America, maybe one day it'll expand to most of the world. That is a beautiful gift. And so as hard as African Americans have had it, as hard as the people who were colonized in Africa had it, this loyalty to each other is a beautiful thing. There is a little bit of sadness to it as well, though, because, you know, until we get to the point where that tribe includes everyone, there's going to be people outside of that tribe. And those people outside of that tribe, that generates conflict instantaneously. And so, there's conflict now. There's a lot of people who don't like each other, not because of bad things that have individually been done, but because of this perception of conflict. That you don't have my back because you're not my color. And once again, that's a very African idea. That's not, the rest of the world doesn't think that way. Do you think that Chinese people, when they were getting slaughtered by Mao Zedong, thought, you know what? I have so much loyalty to that guy because he looks like me. Like, no, they were fleeing the country, getting out of there as soon as they could. And they didn't care anything about it, whether or not he looked like them. Do you think that, you know, when Hitler waltzed up into Poland, the Polish people were like, well, I mean, they're Germans. They're like practically the same as us. No, I don't think they were thinking that. I really don't. That all around the world, no one had this idea before. No one learned this lesson before, that you could have, instead of this tight-knit family group, you could have a huge tribe, a nation, a race. That's a fundamentally new idea. I mean, relatively. At least new to some places. And notice, India only was able to do what they did because of all of these ideas coming around. There's a lot of this concept of race, this concept of different people being genetically different. Everyone feels that way. Obvious. You see it with your eyes. Someone's different than you. But the idea that even though they are different from you, that they can, that they just, the people who do look like you have your back, that's completely new. And once we get past this race stage, once we get past this part where people are only included because of their race, well, then we get to this point where, oh, what? You're American? Oh, you got my back. Oh, what? You're Christian? Oh, well, you got my back. Oh, well, you're what? Maybe one day human? You got my back. Like that's a beautiful idea. That one day in the far distant future we could even get there. And that's kind of the idea, the dream of Martin Luther King, is that all people everywhere, that it's not that there would be a tolerance, a lack of hostility between peoples, but rather that this idea of blackness wouldn't be tied to a color, that this idea of loyalty just by looking at someone wouldn't be tied to a color, but rather would be tied to humanity itself. That the dream of people holding hands and being together, being friends just because it's the right thing to do, that's the Christian dream. And that's the part of Christianity the African Americans have down pat. And I mean, a lot of other Christians, they may have understood it a little bit conceptually, but it's not instinctual in that same way. Because they've never had an example of it until, well, now. And that is a huge benefit for the world. I just hope that the African Americans, the black people across the world, I just hope that they have a bit of patience for the rest of us. A bit of patience to help us to understand where we're coming from, where we don't have that. We don't have someone who has our back, and so it's not you. It's not that we're horribly, unredeemably racist. It's that we treat everyone this way. It doesn't matter the color. You look exactly like me, I'll screw you over just the same, yeah? There's a dog-eat-dog world out there. That's what Europe is. That's what Asia is. So, hopefully you have a little bit of patience for us, because it'll take a while for us to learn and get on your level on that front. So, yeah. We'll get there one day, I hope. And I think the first step is recognizing that it is a difference. That this is not something that is universal. It's not like, oh, you got all of the black people that are good together, and then you have all of the white people that are good together, and then you got all these, like, okay, what's the whole deal with yellow and red? I'm digressing. Video should have already been done by now. But yeah, the idea of colors being what dictates who's got your back, who's your friend, who's gonna support you. That is very much a black idea. I don't think anyone else would have come up with that. And it's good we have it. It's good we have access to that idea, because, oh my goodness, imagine if we didn't. Imagine if we had to learn that straight up from theory with no example. Unimaginable. But thankfully, that is what Africa has brought to the world, has brought to the table. The idea that you can love and care for someone, not because of what they've done for you, not because you know them personally, but just because you look at them and say, they'd probably do the same for me. And that's a beautiful thing.